Hello and welcome. This is a Genrenauts TTRPG design stream because I have a lot of work to do. I got some feedback on the submission that I made of the game to a publisher that shall remain nameless because that's probably the best for me and for them. But in that feedback, there was a lot of stuff that seemed very actionable and nothing that seemed at all impossible, although I think some of the things will be easier to accomplish than others, and how far I'll need to go on some of them is probably TBD. But I had a flurry of energy and got some stuff down yesterday, and then I got a little bit more down this morning, and I thought to myself, this is a good time to do a game design stream, because I have too many video games that I want to play, and therefore my solution for streaming is to play none of them, because I'm too far into Baldur's Gate to start streaming it, and I don't stream often enough to stream Baldur's Gate. Remnant is not a good game for me to stream because I have to pay too much attention to it, and it's taxing my system. And then there's just a bunch of other games, and I reach decision paralysis. So instead, game design. And that's just going to be how it is for today. That's fine. Other stuff for me. Let's see. I have a Valor command, right? Yes. So I need to update the Valor command to talk about how it is nominated for various awards. The Speculate Show Valor that I do with Speculate has been selected for 3 different web festivals, which I'm really proud of. And the first of those is going to be at the end of next month. And then there's one more each over the next 2 months, I think. Yeah, like Minnesota, and then, no, it's New Jersey and then Minnesota and then Baltimore. And I'm not going to get to go to the Minnesota one because it's the same time as I'm doing other things. Also, it's a lot of travel. And New Jersey seems to be the one that the most is like the most developed in terms of having an actual play community that attends. But that may just be based on hearing more from the people who've been to New Jersey. But that's my plans for this year. We'll see for next year. Having book conventions and game conventions and actual play conferences might end up being a little much, but who knows? I miss going places and seeing people. It's just that going places is expensive and seeing people is dangerous because of the pandemic. But fortunately, streaming, 0 chance of pandemic, except in like really weird circumstances. Like if I had a studio room for like streaming actual play and then put everybody in one room, yes, then there would be a pandemic risk, but that's not how I do things. It'd be pretty cool one day to have the funds and the housing to be able to set up like an in-home studio recording setup. But today is not that day. Today is the day that I work on the Genrenauts role-playing game. One of many days. I think I will be putting a good amount of effort into this game over the next few months, especially if I'm able to get back into the rhythm of playtesting the game or start playtesting with a new group so that I can put some of these changes into practice and see how they work per the suggestions. It was very interesting when I got the feedback how much it paralleled what I would describe, what is known in the book world as revise and resubmit. In the book world, for folks that don't know, when you submit a novel for publication, and I think probably a book for publication in general, like nonfiction or, a book of short stories or poetry or anything like that, if the publisher likes what they see, but thinks that the project requires enough work that they don't want to just buy the project and then do that work with the author as part of the process toward publication, they might write a detailed response that is technically a rejection, but gives specific feedback on what the kind of areas for development were and provide a specific invitation for sending the project back to the same team again after addressing those concerns, which is basically the situation that I have here. So I'm just going to make sure that I have removed the feedback to protect the innocent. Okay, I think the smartest thing... Oh, okay. Original says, now I get the joke. Anant told me about how she had an ex who should be an author. He kept trying to revise and resubmit. Now it makes sense. Glad to be able to like retroactively make that make sense for you. Original, good to see you. And thank you for coming and hanging out and for the support. The kids are asleep. The kids are asleep, and I have already talked about this a little bit in the like Strange Friends Discord. Or the Strange Friends section of the Speculate Discord, to be more technical. So here I'm going to give like the breakdown of kind of the areas that they want to see some more development. Sorry, just adjusting here. So they want a clearer sense of what it means to fix stories in play, and had some questions about like, okay, when the Genrenauts fix stories, are like they're reaffirming the status quo of the genre. So like, are they enforcing conformity to like narrative forms? Or you mentioned something about maybe like a solution being that the genres can change. And that's that, you know, I think all of these critiques are fair. And I think that they're going to take varying amounts of work to address, and that some of the work to address them may be in implementation and description as much as, or more so, than changing the actual mechanics of the game, right? Because the book, the text of a game is a bunch of stuff, and then there's stuff that is specifically framed as mechanics, but the whole book is guidance and inspiration to role-playing games. So I think with this feedback, some of the feedback is about the game as expressed in the playtest session that I did with them, and some of it is about the text more specifically, and things that maybe are more about the session in play, I think are things that are easier to fix, because that was about execution, where I can change the execution, and then I just want to make sure that the game book provides the tools and encouragement and guidance to another GM so that they will end up with the same revised execution that I would want to go for, right? If the Genrenauts book is perfectly written, I could hand it to someone that has never read Genrenauts and never heard of the series, and the book would do a good enough job of instruction, illumination, examples, and inspiration so that the game that they ran would be recognizable to me as the person who wrote the game. And even better, would be recognizable to someone that is either familiar with Genrenauts as the book series or familiar with the role-playing game, but not the book series, right? We should end up playing a similar enough game that we are mutually intelligible. That doesn't mean that the games all have to play the same way, that everybody has to do it in the same style, not anything like that. But it should be mutually intelligible so that when another group goes and plays it, there aren't places where they're taking like core elements that make the game what it is to me and doing something completely different. Especially doing that because they didn't understand or because I led them astray, rather than reading the book and going, actually, we're not going to do X, we're going to do Y. Yeah, I think the AD&D second edition to 5e is maybe not it's a parallel. I don't know that for me it's the perfect parallel, because I want to be like the comparison is contemporaneous, whereas like 5e does eventually trace itself back to second edition, but there's, you know, big gaps in time and a bunch of other things. But I think if it's more recognizable from what somebody plays that doesn't know me or doesn't know the series to my thoughts about the game, then 5e is recognizable to someone who has played AD&D second edition, that's probably good. It's been long enough since I've read a second edition book to be able to go deeper on that. So the thing about the kind of fixing stories and proactive versus reaffirming a status quo or enforcing conformity, that I think I already have a pretty good answer for. And it's something that I had been thinking about a little bit with Genrenauts even before sending the book off to submission. I hadn't come down on one side or the other about it. And so what I have, let me go and find where I actually wrote it, because I wrote out an idea of what to do about this. Okay, yeah, because I already put it into the game document. Basically, I started taking notes about the feedback that they gave, going, oh, okay, here's what I want to do about this, here's what I want to do about this, and so on and so forth. But the thing that I came up with for that question of reaffirming or challenging the kind of status quo of the genres. Yeah, The Kids Are Asleep says, I definitely think the notion that the goal isn't so much to return to status quo, but like fixing disruptions caused by regressive elements feels good. And that's basically where I'm landing, because I was discussing this on that Discord yesterday. So I already had this idea of narrative scar theory as like a rumor or as something that some of the Genrenauts believe. That being the idea that a story breach, if you address it and heal it properly, that it's a little bit, and this disclaimer, I'm going to talk about like muscle growth and physiology, and I don't really know those things very well, but my understanding of how muscle growth works is that you strain and you tear the muscle a little bit, but you do it just the right amount, and then you do everything you need to like rebuild it, and it gets stronger, right? And that there's kind of a you hurt it and then it can get stronger kind of element. So if that I applied this to genres, it'd be like, oh, this is like a narrative scar, right? That a breach creates a scar, but then if you heal the scar the right way and you provide the right nutrition, and I apply this metaphor or this analogy in the right way, then the kind of genre landscape of that world is more positive, more healthy, stronger, having gone through that process. The specifics for this is what I'm labeling the transformational dialectic, because I can't not have my academic background. I may get to the point where I want to translate some of that into more casual, less formal language than something like the transformational or transformative dimensional dialectic. Well, transformational. I like transformational better, but I understand that it's maybe not great grammar. Anyway, doesn't matter. That's a problem for later, Mike. So the idea with this theory is that entropy is either a manifestation of regressive, reactionary, misanthropic trends and behaviors on Earth Prime that then create like that they ripple over to the story worlds and create that entropy because these elements are toxic, or that entropy is a natural process across these dimensions. So stories will break down no matter what. Sometimes there is entropy, but what is different is what you do about it. If you see a broken story and go, okay, what did this world intend to do, and how can I patch this broken story or like fix this narrative in such a way that it reaffirms the existing status quo of this genre. Then what the Genrenauts are doing is more reactive, and it is more likely to reinforce an existing status quo. But the status quo in a lot of genres is not great, because there are still a lot of places where there is unexamined ableism, where there is sexism, where there is racism, transphobia, any number of regressive kind of social beliefs or regressive ideas manifest in those situations. And so if you just put things back to status quo, that reaffirms a status quo that in a lot of these genres continues to exclude, marginalize, demonize, and or outright hurt various populations in the world. And so this kind of points to the kind of the most optimistic read I can give of like the United States of America as a country, that there is a dream in the United States of a more perfect union, of a cosmopolitan society, an egalitarian society, and that the U.S. continues to fall short of that dream, but that the best thing that we can do is continue to pursue that ideal, understanding that it is probably impossible to fully and eternally achieve that ideal. So just reading text here. Yeah, so like Arudinel says, quotes, "Oh no, the poor helpless woman has been carried away by the generic dude in a rubber suit monster. What will we do? Someone call the Great White Hunter. She needs rescuing." That still sticks around in sci-fi. Yes, exactly. So that we have this weird thing in these genres that because there's an almost endless number of people telling stories within that genre, and people are kind of drawing on a variety of influences, that in the same day that something like the same day that the third book in N.K. Jemison's Broken Earth trilogy came out, there's a good chance that somebody self-published a fantasy story with like a white savior, straight white guy protagonist with a harem of women who have no real agency of their own, and some like unexamined colonialism bullshit, like on top of other things, right? And that those are both new works being published at the same time. And that while there may be like a trend toward inclusivity in a given genre, or communities that are pushing for better representation and more inclusive work, that movement doesn't erase or block the capability for other people to make works in that genre that are regressive, or that are not as they're not pushing toward inclusivity as actively, right? Where there is like unexamined or unprocessed or unrepentant bias that is manifesting. And that's just how the world of storytelling operates here. And so what Genrenauts is doing is literalizing the metaphor of this interplay and tension between people trying to do different things with stories. And the idea in the game is that there is kind of a movement within the Genrenauts of people who have identified a positive correlation between, like, okay, when we go out and we find a broken story and we address it by undermining oppressive forces, when we address it by enabling people who have been marginalized or excluded or demonized to be more fully kind of a part of the story, to be centered in the story, to be able to kind of advocate for their own needs. When we do that as a response to a broken story, we find that both that genre world and Earth Prime trend toward that greater inclusivity. And my goal is to write about this in the game in such a way that I don't want to say, oh, well, the Genrenauts are the reason why genres get more inclusive and only them. No, that's silly. The idea then would be that there are creators who want to push genres toward more inclusivity, who want space for telling their stories the way that they want to tell them from various marginalized or kind of less heard perspectives, and that is made easier, or that is supported by this interdimensional activity, and that the genre worlds reflect how people are telling stories in Earth Prime, normal world, our world, and that there is a positive feedback loop, and that the Genrenauts can help change the story world, and that the story world moving helps move Earth Prime moving helps move the story world. And so that without the Genrenauts, you might get some movements back and forth because, oh, well, there is just an active movement of, BIPOC writers in a given genre who are supporting each other and publishing each other and uplifting one another, and they help create this kind of partial movement within a genre, that would manifest in a genre world. But that those efforts can be enhanced and supported by what the Genrenauts do. Because if entropy is going to happen anyway, and you go, okay, well, I have to go, we believe that we have to go and fix broken stories, otherwise the world falls, all the dimensions fall apart. But we have a choice of how we do that. Do we go into an action story and go, oh, okay, well, here's the nearest white guy, and so we're going to bring in the nearest white guy, and we're going to kind of do the most clean, pat, just shoot all the bad guys, don't ask any questions kind of story. Or we might look into an action story and go, okay, who in this story has emotional stakes, but the story has kind of excluded them or discounted them? One of the things that one of my playtest groups did with an action story is they focused on a flight attendant in kind of like Die Hard in an airport, which I think is like Die Hard 3 or 4 or whatever. I've only seen the first one, actually. By focusing on a flight attendant who was like a young black woman and made the story more about her because they focused on her and empowering her and creating the circumstances for her to deal with these kind of criminals who are trying to, holding a bunch of people hostage, and they want to steal a plane and go off to like an extradition-free country. Like, this is the sample mission in the Genrenauts book for modern action. By focusing on centering that person who had been excluded or had been left on the margins of a story, they were doing this type of action, which then feeds back into Genrenauts, the role-playing game, being what I want it to be, which is, what if critical theory and criticism was executed through play, right? What if the way you play a role-playing game and the stories you tell in a role-playing game was cultural criticism and fun on its own? So Grimdark is actually one of the examples that I had, but still have kind of like a question mark about, because I think that there are people who see Grimdark a lot more positively than I do, who see Grimdark as, despite everything, people make heroic choices, people try to do their best. For me, that mode feels more like what some people talk about as hope punk. And this gets us back to the challenges of genre definition, right? Because there's no one universal definition of a given genre, right? My view of Grimdark might be focused on, oh, well, this one book series is like the emblematic Grimdark book, and it's about a 14-year-old rapist in a post-apocalypse with a gang of murderers and thieves. And in that world, everyone is terrible and human life is basically worthless. And like, that might be my internal sense of what grimdark is. But then somebody else's sense of grimdark is what I would probably describe as dark fantasy, right? Where things are bad, the kind of physics of that dimension are somewhat more antagonistic toward life, but doesn't go to the end degree or to that extent that I talk about grimdark being. And so, okay, well, we might have in Genrenauts, there might be the epic fantasy genre, and then things break bad, and the resolutions are more about kind of one powerful dude fixing things by doing a bunch of violence and not really thinking about the consequences. And he gets rewarded with a compulsory prize wife. Does that then push fantasy toward dark fantasy? And then does dark fantasy continue along that track and become grimdark? Could you then, with enough missions where you include marginalized perspectives, where you affirm the value of life, push kind of, okay, well, the balance of the genre used to trend toward grimdark, and now more of the genre trends toward dark fantasy, or more of the genre trends toward epic fantasy. And it's not like they've gotten rid of grimdark entirely, but they've shifted the balance. And one way that I may express that is kind of how it would basically address a different question from the publisher feedback. If I am more specific about detailing the kind of fundamental rules of the genre in a given region, that may make it more concrete and give specific territory for these Genrenauts to fight over. And what I mean by that is an idea that I came up with that I describe as pillars. People describe, Dungeons & Dragons 5th edition has 3 pillars: exploration, like role play, and combat. And I'm just thinking about pillar because that's the language that's used there. It doesn't really have anything else to do with D&D 5e. I'm making a very different game. But if every genre has, let's say 3, because that's a common number, it's nice because it's an odd number, and so you can have 2 and 1 or 1 and 2, and you can see the balance, versus if you had 4 rules or 6 rules or something. If every genre has 3 pillars that are written out, that everybody in the game knows, okay, we know that our pillars for the rom-com genre right now are, where did I put my pillars for rom-com thing? I wrote out some examples, but and I want to actually refer back to them. Yeah, so if my pillars for rom-com are, there'd be some kind of title, but then the rules say take plus effect if you make an emotional appeal while trying to change someone's mind, right? That the rule that we're talking about here is that people change as a result of their mind changing about things through emotional appeals, right? In a rom-com, it's been my experience that people are able to make changes in their life or in their worldview when there is a really heightened emotional moment, and somebody either jars them out of their perspective through that emotional kind of through line, or via an emotional argument, or they recontextualize some of their experience through some revelation that tugs or pushes on existing emotion that they have. So, plus effect when you make an emotional appeal to change someone's mind, maybe that's a pillar, and that's a positive pillar because it gives you a bonus, right? Maybe the second pillar is that, people have walls. And so gather information questions to discover a person's inner or secret desires. Roles to make that kind of gather information effort are always at least risky. You can't have a controlled situation where you try to get to someone's inner desires, because people put up walls. And that might be an example of a negative pillar, right? We're defining this genre by a challenge or by a difficulty, by something that stands in the way of people's happiness. And then if I am running a campaign where every genre that's on your beat has 2 negative pillars and 1 positive pillar, because we want to start the group kind of on the back foot with a lot of work to do to make these genres more forward thinking, more inclusive, more progressive, whatever. Like, people can play the game however they want. And so if somebody wanted to play Genrenauts and have it be all about like putting straight white men back, quote unquote, back on top, they can do that. I will just hate them if I find out that they're doing that. And so I don't want to design for them. What I want to design for is the people that are doing kind of the same thing that I'm doing with stories, and give them the tools to do that in Genrenauts, even if they don't do creative works in other media, or as a way of doing this work in tabletop role-playing games in addition to whatever else they do, right? A lot of people who play TTRPGs are also writers, artists, musicians, so on and so forth, any number of things. So when you start the Genrenauts role-playing game, every genre has 3 pillars, and 2 pillars are defined in a way that reflects the problems that are built into or are historical within a given genre, but then 1 pillar reflects kind of a positive or aspirational element. Then the Genrenauts can go in, and when a story breaks in the rom-com world, they might try to fix it in such a way that encourages people to lower their emotional barriers, to not bury their feelings so deep. And that succeeding in a patch where your approach directly addressed one of those pillars might tick a clock or give you extra XP or do something that will let you build toward changing one of the pillars. Where when you do X amount of work or something, you might change that pillar about, so The Kids Are Asleep says, it's like the arc of the universe bends towards justice, but people have to be holding a lever, right? Like former President Obama has a quote about this. There's a lot of people have kind of grabbed onto that arc of justice thing and talked about how it doesn't just happen for free, that it takes a lot of work to do that. And that there is the chance to like literalize the metaphor of some of that work through Genrenauts by basically asserting to this story universe that stories need not only be a particular way. That what if we got to an ending in a different way? And that you get that opportunity to be aspirational. Right. Arunel says, fix it so the groom runs off with the best man instead of the bride for a change. I'd watch that rom-com, right? That in like big budget or in like studio romances, there are not many studio romances getting notable budgets that are anything other than one man, one woman, right? We're not seeing much in the way of poly romances. We're not seeing much in the way of any queer romances. Heartstopper on Netflix was a fairly big deal because it was a fairly major work that centered a gay relationship and things like that, where in some part of a genre, in some media, there may be a lot more work of a certain type that includes marginalized perspectives, right? There are a ton of gay romances in fiction, in comics, yaoi is a whole category in manga. But when we look over to the world of big budget TV and film, it's still pretty rare. And so we have that like uneven landscape, and there is contention happening, right? Another way of looking at Genrenauts is, what if we literalize the culture war? Where the idea that how we tell stories and who gets to be in stories and what stories are rendered as acceptable or appropriate or valid or worthwhile says something about what we value and how we see the world. Yeah, and so to Rudnil, to take your point to a greater degree that I don't think you intended, so as to not, like, I'm not blaming you on this, but a way that we might see some of that contention happening is, oh, well, we're going to have gay romances, but those gay romances are going to be like, they're going to demonize women, right? They're going to say, well, women aren't important because only men are important. And so we're going to have a man and then another man and two men being together. And that's really unimportant, because within some elements of like gay men, like communities of gay men, there is weirdness around women, right? There's a different form of sexism of like, oh, well, we don't, like, women don't need to exist. Similarly, I see within some like lesbian or sapphic communities, there is like demonization of men to an essentialist degree, as opposed to a demonization of toxic masculinity or a demonization or rejection of compulsory heterosexuality, right? And so there may even be places where the contestation over inclusion can have results that are unintended, right? That the drawback or the part of the pushback might come in a more concealed fashion, where it's like, oh, okay, well, you're going to get to have more gay romances, but this other regressive element is going to sneak in. So more gay romances, but here's some sexism that we're going to parcel with it and pretend that they have to come together, right? That you can have this, but you have to have that. Yes. So, right. Gender war. Yeah. So like something like Why the Last Man. Like, oh, okay, well, we're going to get rid of all of the men. Parentheses. We actually mean cis men, and we're largely going to erase and or ignore both trans people and non-binary people in order to tell this particular point. And so the Hulu show did a different thing than the comic did, and part of that is based on the fact that the Hulu show came a lot later, and so prevailing perspectives about a few different things have already changed, and that works can be well-intentioned in trying to push in one way, but still have flaws in another way, reaffirming the fact that the fight to make narrative and to make culture more inclusive and more forward-thinking and more compassionate is an ongoing, very complicated one. Yeah, swapping bigotry doesn't necessarily equate to altered power levels as well, as The Kids Are Asleep says, right? So in Why the Last Man, misogyny doesn't exist, it doesn't disappear in that world, right? Because women internalize misogyny. You don't have reverse racism because unless the entire power structure that undergirds racism is eliminated, and eliminated to the point that internalized versions in the people that survived, unless those are also erased, just a swap doesn't create an actual opposite result. Which is a very good point. And so there's so much meaty stuff to do with all of this, because it is, what if we had a dimension hopping adventure game that let us investigate all of this stuff, that let us interrogate all of this stuff? And so one of the other points that was, I think, a challenge for them, absolutely original, even if ideals are impossible, we should always reach for them, right? This reminds me of the idea that utopia is a process rather than a destination. A utopian society or utopian societal movement is always trying to be better. So this idea of having like a fun dimension hopping adventure RPG that tackles really heavy emotional, political, and sociological stuff, that can maybe be a challenge for some people, right? Because there's a range of tone. In the playtest game that I ran, I used what I've titled the squeeze out job, which involves a family that includes like two characters that would often be protagonists dealing with, illness in the family and caretaker challenges and like problems for for their kid, like challenges that you face as a parent when your kid is facing stuff in school where you can't just go and fix it yourself, because it's about how the kids in that school treat each other. And that if you just kind of come down as an external force, you're not actually going to fix the problem, because the problem has to get fixed kind of internally, or someone has to be removed entirely from the bad situation. That's material can be pretty heavy because it's very real. To then come in with like a dimension hopping adventure thing where you're like trying to rearrange stuff, that can be tricky, especially if some of the characters that you're bringing in are utilizing concepts that kind of come from a very different default tone. So if you had like a Disney princess as a Genrenaut, then go and do the squeeze out job, is it a good idea to have that Disney princess do like and like bring a bunch of pigeons and then ask the pigeons to do something for them to deal with the medical debt that family has? Is that too much of a tonal gap? That's going to depend on the group. What I think I want for the game is, at the very least, some guidance about tone. There's one way of doing it where I could just like outright create a tonal rubric of like, okay, here's a tonal rubric from absolute wackiness to like totally stone-faced gritty realism, or tone from nothing ever really goes wrong and things always end up good, happily ever after always wins, to kind of like a grimdark, right? I could give like a number value to all of those, and I could say, okay, this genre tends to default to a 2 on the tone scale, and 2 is parentheses gritty life, gritty bad endings are frequently possible, and like unpack that. And then I would have a section in the book that is, here's the tone scale, and then every genre gets assigned a tone level, and there's some rules about how if you do something in a genre that is more than 2 points off from that genre's tone level, then you incur additional ripple, right? Because it's too much whiplash for that setting. And I might go beyond that to have like so Arudnell, I think The Kids Are Asleep is referencing a specific history of people talking about the idea of reverse racism that is not incompatible with what I think you were talking about. Yeah, because if the bigotry is about dividing people, yeah, okay, cool. I apologize. Thank you for clarifying. Yeah, so your point builds on her point in this case, because with racism, right? Power is an essential element, because and this gets into like popular cultural definitions versus like academic, more precise definitions, right? If the more precise definition of racism is bias plus power, that systemic power must be applied to or used to magnify bias in order to get what we talk about as racism, and then other people see it only as bias, and that that disjunct creates a huge problem in having a productive conversation. So I could go into greater detail with tone, where I could give it some numbers or at least provide some guidance and say, as I see it, the post-apocalypse genre tends to default to a tone that is like this. And if you bring in a character who is, if a character who is a specialist in like a sitcom genre does a mission in the post-apocalypse genre and tries to use an approach or a pitch or does kind of a scheme that is really out of genre for that, for post-apocalypse, that might incur additional ripple, or it might take a worse position, right? There's a greater chance of blowback, of bad consequences from trying to do this because it's so out of genre. Or I might say that it impacts effect. Oh, well, trying to do that is going to have reduced effect here because that's just not how people in this world see the spectrum of possibility. And that then what Genrenauts maybe are encouraged to do is find ways to push at the margins. What if we tried to make things a bit better here? Or we accept that we're going to get a lot of pushback, but we're going to go ahead and take this big swing because we're not going to be satisfied unless we do this bigger thing. And that part of what the Genrenauts are facing as a challenge is this idea of cultural inertia. Whether it is this idea that it's hard to change culture all at once in one big go, or it is some kind of manifestation of the inertia or the weight of history or regressive elements within people producing material of that culture. I could mechanize some of that as a way of synchronizing or kind of rounding out the ways that these genre worlds in Genrenauts make material narrative conventions and turn them into dimensional physics. And so that's basically a way of kind of integrating all three things, or all three of the four things. Hi, the Rising Tides. They say, this is interesting because it also fulfills another fanfic creative desire. How would this otherwise seemingly out-of-place character perform normally in this genre, right? So if you've got your Disney princess who goes to a post-apocalypse world, how does that work, right? Does the post-apocalypse world change the Disney princess? Does it like put some holes in her optimistic worldview, or is she able to bring that optimistic worldview and give hope to people who have lost a lot of hope? Is it some little bit of both? Sorry, I dropped my... Where'd it go? I dropped the thing I was fidgeting with, so... Ah, I see. So I think that basically gives me the way to hit three of these four things. That the version of the game where I make changes... Sorry, I'm putting my shoes back on and I'm just getting terrible like click from my earphones, and it's very distracting. Okay, I'm back. Thank you for your patience. So to cycle back around, the bits of feedback that they gave, the first one was about like a sense of what it means to fix stories, and a question about status quo and like reaffirming a bad status quo versus pushing for a better status quo. Questions about tone and tonal range and guidance about, and this is using language from the feedback, how to meld these tonally very different elements. Because as they see it, genre mashing is like the expectation in the game, right? Because you're traveling across a bunch of different genres. Yeah, and so originally you talk about Fallout 4, bringing that perspective of a person from a really different context can be really interesting and illuminating, because it lets you see something, or for me, one of the great opportunities is the ability to see something familiar from a different perspective, right? What does a 1950s housewife, how can she operate within, what would she think of a particular version of a post-apocalypse that provides a different perspective than what is frequently talked about, right? Like, okay, is this a 1950s housewife who worked in a factory during World War II and who lost siblings and who wanted to, continue some type of work, like, wanted to be an engineer, but it's the 1950s. And so her options were very limited outside of like get married, right? People within different historical circumstances have constraints put upon them, and they struggle against those constraints in different ways to different degrees. People in some situations embrace those restraints and or decide not to fight against them in, a more in like a really active way, but instead carve out space for themselves within those restraints. And the idea that you could bring somebody who has had those experiences into different genres, how do they then react to something like the Immortan Joe, like the settlement that Immortan Joe controls in Mad Max Fury Road, right? Where everybody has some degree of radiation poisoning, where there's very few opportunities to make a living that doesn't involve doing war and death for Immortan Joe. Right. Wendy the welder, Wendy the waitress, Wendy the whack, right? Women's Army Corps, Wendy the army nurse, Wendy the intelligence operative, Wendy the, the younger woman who is 18 in 1956 and does not have memories of World War II in the same way that Wendy, who is 18 in 1945, does. And so you can get really specific in those cases, because the specificity is what's going to give you an interesting detail or provide a clearer lens through which you see these other situations. Because you can utilize just straight up stereotypes, but I think players are probably going to find that they're going to have a more interesting experience if they dig beyond stereotype to specifics, if they think about the ways that stereotypes are the manifestation or are the like aggregate rounding off of a whole bunch of like specifics with variation. I'm not familiar with Major Houlihan. I'm sorry, Rudnell. That name doesn't ring a bell for me. So if you want to unpack that a little bit, I'd be very happy to hear about it, but no worries if not. MASH head nurse. Oh, okay. Yeah, I've watched very little MASH. And what I did watch was many, many years ago. So thank you for explaining. So that's note number 2 is tone, and then the fourth note is mechanically they wanted the game to go further, to have more mechanics that are specific to Genrenauts, that kind of reflect the focus and the intention of the game through specific mechanical design. And that I think I can definitely do. I was already playing with some elements, and I think there's a few different ways of taking it, and having the genre pillars is already an additional step there. Some of the other things that I've talked about are already a step there. If I have guidance about like additional ripple or additional challenge or reduced effect, if you kind of go too far outside of genre. And maybe there's like a push-pull of, if you take the easy road and do what is expected in the genre, it's maybe going to be easier and more effective, but maybe it doesn't get you one of your XP prompts, or maybe it doesn't help you tick the clock that will let you change a negative pillar into a positive pillar. And so those, I think, all fit together pretty well, thanks to having gotten to talk it through here and talking on Discord with the Rising Tides and the Kids Are Asleep and other folks, and talking it through with Meg and other stuff that I've done. Like, when I got this feedback and I started thinking about it, I knew that I would need to talk my way through a lot of stuff, because that's just how my brain works. That verbal processing is really useful for me, because I'm very used to improvisation, and I find that I can think when I'm talking, or I can think things through when I'm talking in a way that is different from, and for me more useful than just thinking through things for myself, to myself, by myself. Because conversation and feedback and just the way that I have to think about things to frame them for talking helps me work things through. Absolutely do not worry about going on about a character that you really appreciate. That's 1,000% on brand for this conversation, and I'm really glad to hear kind of about a character that you care a lot about and why you care a lot about them. So thank you for sharing that, Arudnell. So this is more talking about Major Houlihan. In fact, I was just hearing about a MASH-themed TTRPG earlier this week, which reminded me that I had heard very good things about MASH, but when I watched it, I was so young that I don't think I understood or appreciated basically anything beyond like the most overt, simplest version of the story, because I was like 6 when I watched any amount of MASH. Yeah, the tabletop world is amazing. Like, the fact that we have games that are so specific is really cool. So a question from the Rising Tides. Because the game as is considers individual genres, what would the game state of a well-approached genre combination? Is, for instance, True Lies or Last Action Hero a genre breach, or are these stories operating as intended? This is a great question. And I don't know that there is one right answer for me, because in writing Genrenauts, I acknowledge the fact that genre combination is much more common than even a lot of criticism talks about, right? Because romance is a plot genre. Science fiction or fantasy is frequently a setting genre, but not necessarily a plot genre. But some science fiction stories do take a science fictional plot, and we might better describe that plot as being within the science fiction tradition than by being like a thriller plot, right? If we have a story that is set in the year 2099 on a moon colony, but it's a murder mystery, then that is a science fiction setting with a murder mystery plot. If it is a story in 2099 that is about AI, like actual AI, not like generative text stuff, that is about AI advocating for their rights despite not having bodies, I am more likely to talk about that as being a science fictional plot question, or that is the type of plot of a science fiction, because what does it mean to be a person, the rights of artificial people or the rights of non-biological people is something that comes up frequently enough in science fiction that the through line to me is science fiction. The through line might be something else for somebody else, right? They might say that's a civil rights story, and that they could draw a connection between that and other civil rights stories. Or a creator might draw on civil rights stories and then bring them into a science fictional setting. Because none of these are cut and dry, being the designer who has to give a framework, I'm a little bit forced, or I might be a little forced to be more concrete or to be more definitive than I would generally prefer to be. Where I'm fine with talking about the fact that True Lies is, is True Lies a romance story? Yeah, because robot comes from, is it? I know some of the story, right? So robot comes from robota, which is Czech, right? From that store. Yeah. Is that Chapek? Capek. RUR, as the kids are asleep has talked about, right? That there is a long enough thread in science fiction now about the rights of artificial beings that you can just look at that conversation and you can take it away from civil rights stories about Earth, where the analog and the parallels between stories about robots and stories about the, often specifically the enslavement of African people, that the parallels there are incredibly strong, and that some storytellers attempt to completely leave those parallels behind. And sometimes when they do that, they end up recreating or reifying existing problems or existing structures. And so is the answer to that to talk about everything as being messier, because everything is several things at once, and there's not a one-to-one stories in one genre impact stories in another genre. Okay. Yeah, I think all of that, but then how do I do game design about it? And so that might mean maybe the way to address that is by returning back to this idea of pillars, in that these genre worlds are not monolithic, but they have that the pillars could also be expressed as centers of gravity, right? That these pillars are organizing central gravity exerting principles of narrative physics that stories then move around. And so that in your spy story of True Lies, you have romance elements. But we talk about it as being part of the spy genre because it's also rotating. It's also orbiting, I guess, sorry. It's orbiting around this other pillar of narrative. Yeah, like Mr. and Mrs. Smith. One of the things I already have in Genrenauts is this idea of a catastrophic crossover, where a crossover that is unintended. Because there are some genres that started as a genre mash, right? Mr. and Mrs. Smith, and then you get Mr. and Mrs. Witch, which is a new or upcoming rom-com book. That's Gwenda Bond, right? Mr. and Mrs. Witch, at least is the one that I'm thinking of. It's out, great. At what point does a crossover then just become a new genre, right? People talk about cyberpunk as being science fiction plus noir. Cyberpunk has become enough its own thing that there's a lot of cyberpunk that is not noir, and that there's a lot of cyberpunk that really isn't about being science fiction, right? We can argue that the world of being being a person trying to live in lots of places in the world right now is already cyberpunk, because it's already about individual people being oppressed by monolithic, multinational, amoral kind of mega corporations that don't care about individual lives. And so our life is already cyberpunk. So I guess then the question is, how do I have two types of crossovers? How do I have the jarring crossover, and how do I have the smooth crossover? So the Rising Tide says, and I think that I've just browsed this, but I'm going to read it over again so I can process it more. As if a story were an atom and one genre is the nucleus, but the other comparisons are additional electrons, but without those electrons it would be a less complex but not less valuable compound. And it's a question of which is more volatile than the other, right? Is Mr. and Mrs. Smith more a romance or more a spy movie? That's probably going to depend on who you ask, because there's people who don't care about the romance but like the spy action stuff, or there's people who approach it as a romance reader and don't care so much about the action except as it expresses the emotion. And so the protocols, the audience or the reader protocols that you bring to a work help frame how you see it and how you categorize it. You know, are the original Star Wars movies 4, 5, and 6, are those science fiction movies? Are they space opera movies? Are they fantasy movies in space? So what I could do is I could include maybe two or more ways of getting to having a crossover. Or I can include material in the game with a section that's like generating missions that talks about how a given genre original. I would say it can be useful to talk about Star Wars through any of those lenses. It can be useful to talk about Star Wars like, oh, here's a science fiction story where we have an almost entirely unexamined category of enslaved people in droids. And all of the people who are framed as protagonists, almost all of them are just fine with this idea that droids are property. And so, yes, C-3PO is modeled off of the robot from Metropolis, yeah. So you could have, because I already have stuff about the like catastrophic crossover, where the crossover is like it's basically, it's not settled. They're not fully integrated. Everything is kind of messier. Than for me, the contrast would be like, oh, here is a work that is very thoughtfully and thoroughly a crossover that carefully integrates and combines those elements, where something like Brick, the Rian Johnson film, is noir and a high school drama. And it's a crossover that, if I were to categorize, would not be a catastrophic crossover, but a more thoroughly integrated crossover, right? Because it's fully thought through, as opposed to like this weird breach of one genre into another. Because a crossover, like a kind of a Brick style crossover, if your team has the noir genre as something that's part of their beat, that's still really interesting and different. Because it's like, oh, here's a noir, but we're in this different setting. Pivotal crossover, Star Wars Cyberpunk. Yeah, two genres spawning a third. I might need to think more and longer about how to categorize these different forms of crossovers, because I think it will be interesting to do missions in each of them. Like, here is a weirder, wackier crossover where things aren't integrated well, and so stuff is a little bit disjointed, versus a crossover that's more like Brick or like Mr. and Mrs. Smith. And so the thing is, it's going to be really hard for Genrenauts to not end up also being Mike writing a nonfiction book about genre and storytelling. I don't know that I'm going to be able to avoid it. It may just have to be that thing. And if I get a publisher and we decide to like go the crowdfunding route, I could absolutely 1,000% see taking inspiration from Girl by Moonlight, Andrew Gillis's game published with Evil Hat, where a lot of the stretch goals for that crowdfunding campaign were about funding a zine, the Zine by Moonlight, which then asked a bunch of people to write essays and fiction and do art, expressing and investigating their feelings and thoughts about the game and kind of what it means to people. And so that would be really cool. Okay, so the Rising Tides has another comment that I'm going to read so that I can make sure to talk through it. What possibly reveals itself in that Brick comparison that is that a catastrophic crossover is possibly as easy as which of these elements would make the characters' lives worse if it got bigger. Sidebar from me, that's a very interesting framing. Back to the Rising Tides. Like if Brick were just a drama, then it's the story of a teenager just experiencing tragedy without any preparedness. But if it's just a noir, it's a story of a teenager trying to battle a drug dealer and getting beaten up. Hello, Mighty Mur. I'm sorry that your phone isn't handling the stream well. Thank you for dropping by. I can check in with you about this later to get you like access to the conversation if you like. Oh, I've completely tapped away from Twitch here, but I am getting chat. Okay, great. Yeah, so I think what I would probably end up doing about crossover is adding more text rather than changing much that I have. So I would have the kind of current entanglements and things that talk about like, here's a catastrophic crossover, but then also add language about these other forms of crossovers, either as special missions or as some other thing, you know, as like maybe an advanced mode of play that you would go to, or think about maybe it's that catastrophic crossovers are when a genre that isn't in the team's beat crosses over with a genre that is, right? And so in the example of Brick, if the team has high school drama and noir in their beat, then Brick is a crossover of places where the team has expertise. And so then the team gets to play to that and they have more expertise. The crossovers wouldn't come from the fact that the team has those specialties. So I'd want to talk about like, do it this way because it lets you highlight the characters and having their specialties, and because you know that the players are already interested in each of those genres. And so putting those genres into conversation through this type of crossover is more likely to be something that they're going to be interested in. And so maybe that's the way to do that. But thank you again, the Rising Tides, for that idea of which of these elements would make the characters' lives worse if it got bigger. I think that's an interesting framing to consider. And so that's all of that. We're coming up on an hour 30. I will accept that, or the fourth note that they gave is, I would say, simultaneously the most minor, but may also be the most difficult to address, which is that they don't like the title. And I get it. I've had people like kind of push back or have questions about the title for the fiction series, because for a lot of people, the word astronaut, they don't think about the construction, right? Astronaut is a whole word. It's not star traveler. 1080 or nothing. Really. That's very weird. Why is that? I'm going to make a note to myself. Wow, my typing is just totally fucked right now. It means it's not encoded. So I know vaguely what an encoder means, and I know that stuff is encoded, but I don't know what settings I have or haven't done on OBS or Twitch to mean that it's not being encoded, and therefore creating this limitation for folks. So I will have to loop around to that and see if I can do something about that for next time to make it. It's on Twitch's end. Okay, yeah, and I've talked with Greg about some of the reasons for streaming at different resolutions and visual quality levels. Like, my thought was, if I can do 1080, I want to be able to do 1080. But the idea that something becomes hard for people to access if I'm only doing it at 1080, yeah, then that's definitely a problem for me to want to address. Maybe that means that when you get X amount of viewers, they encode the stream for other resolutions. Okay, right. You're only important if you're important. I get it, Twitch. Again, that's Twitch's end. So the Rising Tide says, I think insert title here, the Genrenauts RPG is very doable and may just come down to a placeholder team name designation. But then it would seem overwhelmingly military operative in a way I imagine you'd like to avoid. Yeah, I think, Sigma Team, the Genrenauts role-playing game, doesn't necessarily communicate what I want to. What I'm going to do here, however, before we wrap up, is I'm going to read a bunch of the bad titles that I came up with yesterday while I was trying to burn my way through bad ideas to a better idea. And so if any of these titles, if you think any of these titles are actually good, I would love to hear it. Yes. So Triffity Matt says, astronauts, I like Genrenauts, but then I had 3 years of Latin, which is uncommon, right? So Genrenauts, Psychonauts is that's a video game which uses the same type of construction. Cosmonauts is the Russian term. And so Genrenauts makes sense to me, but I get that it takes a couple of extra steps if you're coming to it and Genrenauts is the only word that you're hearing or the only word that you're reading. Garlic knots. Story sliding. I don't like. I don't hate that. So here's a bunch that I came up with that I don't know if any of them are any good. Meg gave me one that I think is pretty good. But I'm just gonna write down some of these suggestions, Triffity Mats, if you don't mind. I'm just gonna put them under a category that's attributed to you, so I know. I appreciate the alliteration as well. Okay, so here are some names that I came up with, and I don't know if any of them are any good. Story Doctors, Pilfered Prose, Story Heist, Genre Heist, Story Breakers, Once Upon a Crime, Stealing Happily Ever After, Happily Ever Heist, Happily Never After, Department of Narrative Intervention, Let's Steal a Genre, Genre Mashers, Genre Radicals, Story Radicals, Revision by Crime, Stet Incorporated, Trope Twisters, The Happily Ever After Job, Genre Mechanics, Story Breach, The Multiverse Library, Multiverse of Stories, Trope Smashers, Fiction Filchers, Story Stick-Up, Multiverse Mashup. This is like the season episode list for a Netflix series, right? So I think some of these are better than others. The one that Meg gave me that I think is probably a pretty good placeholder title, if not Fiction Fixtures. I'm going to write that down as well because it's fun and alliterative. The one that Meg gave me that I especially like is World Breakers. Whether that is World Breakers as 2 words or World Breakers as 1 word. World Breakers as a permutation or a riff on World Builders is certainly a thing. World Breakers, that conveys a sense of stakes. It conveys a sense of conflict, right? Breaking of a thing. But if I'm going with this like narrative dialectic approach, you have to break it so you can put it back together better. Right? This idea that you have to break down stories to their component elements to put them back together in a better way. So thematically, that has some promise as well. I don't know. My hope is that if I do a good enough job on the other 3, and then I come back with a title that is better or easier to parse than Genrenauts, that if I do everything else well, I don't need to have like an S tier title for that publisher to say, okay, cool, let's work together moving forward. They might say, we still don't love this title, but let's work on it together. Instead of, we still don't love this title, so I'm sorry, we're not going to take it. My hope would be that if I do a good enough job with everything else, the title isn't going to be a deal breaker for them. Yeah, I think the thing with the title is that ideally I'm going to be able to have that title and then the Genrenauts role-playing game. So World Breakers, the Genrenauts role-playing game, a little bit easier to figure out. Trope Twisters, Let's Deal a Genre, those are maybe a little bit more on point. So, titles are hard. Titles give me a headache. A large number of my titles are just, this is the premise of the thing, because I tend to think in story premise. And so it's been Genrenauts in my head for so long that it's difficult to kind of push far beyond that. But that's something that I'm just going to have to get over and deal with, because I don't want that to stand in the way of this game finding a good home. So I am very grateful for all of your suggestions on titles, Triffity Mats and other folks, and for your feedback. Just going to go back here. Where'd you go? So that is that. That is kind of me talking my way through / reviewing the feedback that I got from this publisher that kind of takes the form of a revise and resubmit response, where they want me to work on this and, not send it back to them right away, right? They want to see development, and they want to see that new version be tested and kind of put through the ringer to make sure that it works and that it does what it is intended to do. And then when I feel confident about that I've addressed all of those concerns and those places where they want to see me dig deeper, and that it's done enough to justify kind of a space on their publication list, on, a space in their list, that then I can send it back. Now, making all that work is easier said than done, maybe, right? I still have the advantage that I'm making a game of a thing that I've already written a bunch of words on, right? I've written probably between 250 and 300,000 words of Genrenauts fiction at this point, because the season 1 collection is about 180,000 words. And then I've written the season 1 or the first episode of season 2. I wrote the second episode, but I haven't revised and released it. I wrote the episode 0 prequel, and then I've written several short stories in Genrenauts that have appeared in various places, right? I've written just a couple of words, right? All right, so I read that wrong because the purple that it gave Lord Lothar was close enough the Arudnell that it gave Arudnell that I'm misread it. So just a couple of words, right? So I'm going to want to do more playtests, which probably means me running playtests so that I can get the feedback pretty immediately. I ran external playtests. Getting feedback for an external playtest and getting an external playtest up and running consistently is very difficult. For me, at least. It may be easier for other people. What I hear from other designers is that it's just hard, period. I already do a lot of things. The color, I'd have no idea how the color thing shows up. It's different colors on different things. So like in OBS, Lord Lothar is a darker purple. On Twitch, Lord Lothar is orange. So I have no idea why this does anything. So it may be consistent for people. It's green on the chat window. I don't know. So you weird color stealing people. So it may just be different for every single person. I don't know what they're trying to do. Or it might be like based on when you came into the chat, right? That the first person that comes in the chat gets a given color and then it filters on from there. I don't know. Anyway, that's neither here nor there, basically. So there's some more design work to do. Then there's going to be more writing work to do, because some of the design work is going to be thinking and some of it's going to be writing, and then making sure it's all in it's all on the page, it's all in the game, and then doing some more playtesting, and then making sure that the writing is doing everything, that the text itself does everything that I want it to do. And then I can resubmit. And then if they want to play another game, running that game in a way that reflects the game as it is, not the game as it was. I think it is literally just rendering different colors for different people in different contexts, Arudnell. I don't think it's your vision being weird. So that is all that. That's not all of my thoughts about ways to address those design concerns, but the last one that I have is a little bit less formed, and I'm already I was having a bit of a rough day already just because I was feeling torn between the impulse to do all the things, oh my goodness, don't waste time, you're not getting enough done, and the contradictory impulse of you should just take a month off from everything and rest more, Mike. And these are both voices in my head. These are contradictory impulses that are happening simultaneously. And so that's a problem. So because my attention has been on this, because I was waiting for the feedback for so long, and because the feedback was more encouraging than disheartening. Story stuff at the table with pizza and soda. Yeah, right. There are more RPG titles that are longer now, but while I would love to be able to have a game title that's that long and casual, who knows? Slug Blaster, right? Slug Blaster's a great title. It's not long, but it's weird. the last thing I had about like mechanical differentiation in genre is like, oh, do I want to have genre specific actions in the way that like, oh, Brinkwood has actions that go with the masks, and those actions interact with your basic actions in an interesting way, or like in Band of Blades, where each specialist playbook has a specialist action, but those aren't really rolled. They give you a resource that you can spend. Or do I want to do a secret third thing that's neither of the way that those other games do an extra action or some other thing? And then does that mean that I have too many different mechanics for the different genres, and I would want to consolidate or simplify some other things? That I'm going to have to figure out later. Because now what I think I want to do is wrap it up for today, and who knows? Story sliders, sliding stories, yeah. Sliding stories goes to sliding doors. Titles are hard. So I'm going to wrap it up there. Thank you so much to everybody who has come by to hang out. So Arudnell, Turfity Mats, Lord Lothar, The Kids Are Asleep, Mighty Myrrh, The Rising Tides, and I think that is everybody, at least that I've seen in chat. Thank you also to folks that were not in chat and were just hanging out, watching, lurking, whatever it is that you like to do. Thank you to all folks across all of those different categories. This VOD is basically I'm going to turn off the VOD on Twitch, and then it's going to be on YouTube unlisted for patrons of my Patreon. Do I have a Patreon command? Great. So as a way of kind of giving more material to patrons, especially folks who are at the $3 and up level, which is like the Genrenauts level, who were getting the self-published Genrenauts and are getting like all this extra information about the Genrenauts RPG. If you want to access the Genrenauts RPG document, this like working document, the way that you can do that is by becoming a patron. I'm going to put up a post on, Oreos. I'm going to put up a post about some of this process that goes with this video, or that unpacks some of this, or just kind of puts some of it into text. And then when I have my kind of first wave of additional writing or writing changes for the document for the game, then I'll put that up for patrons as well. And then keep those folks involved and informed as I continue this design process to try to get the game to the point where I can find a good home for it and it can come to the world. So that is that. I don't know what I'm going to do on Friday. There are too many video games to play, but I want to try to do something. And I'll figure out what that is going to be, because I don't have a Speculate stream that we're doing on Friday, but we do need to do a Strange Friends recording sometime soon. So we'll figure that out. A lot of people will be playing Starfield. I think that's going to include Lord Lothar. Folks that are excited to watch Starfield as soon as possible should check out Lord Lothar's streams later this week, because he's going to be trying to stream as soon as the universe will allow, is the sense that I got when we were talking last night. So hop over to his channel and give a follow if you want to experience the game through his eyes. Lothar and I have had many, many fun conversations about stories and video games and storytelling, so you can kind of get the game through his perspective over there. I probably will not be playing Starfield upon launch or even soon after launch, because one, I have too many video games to play, and two, I have a bad track record with Bethesda games, and it's not them, it's me. So I'm going to wait and watch other people. So yeah, in chat, Thursday, 8 p.m. Eastern, if folks want to go over and check out the Starfield with Lord Lothar. That's going to be all of that. Thank you, Turfity Mats, for the encouragement. I appreciate it. And thanks, everybody, for hanging out. And now I'm going to go to my ending thing so that I can have a little bit of an outro and send you all off with some happy music. And I will catch you all next time. Thanks. Bye.